Life's pretty good, ain't it? We get to wake up each day, enjoy a wide range of pleasures, earn a proper income, and hang out with friends. We live in the most prosperous time in human history. By any measurement, people that live now are better off than people living 100 years ago. It's pretty wild to look at someone living during World War I or World War II and see how different we live nowadays. On the other hand, you can say that life's pretty strict. We have a bunch of rules and worries, and no one knows what tomorrow's going to bring. Right now, we live in a very uncertain time.
ABC News national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy for more on this. Mick, the Russian Defense Ministry now says that the Moscow's crew...
There are problems everywhere and everyone claims to have solutions. And it seems like life as we know it is just falling apart. This isn't true. Obviously. We do live in an uncertain time filled to the brim with problems. But there's an equal amount of love and freedom mixed in. I guess this is the part of human nature that everyone lives, but no one wants to see. Throughout history, we can see that we haven't changed that much. Humans crave freedom and social interaction. We want to be just and fair, but we also want to be right even when we're wrong. There was another time in history when human nature spread its wings like this. That era is called the Wild West. Let's turn back the clock and see what life feels like and what we can learn from this era of freedom and opportunity. Some notes before we begin. Daily life for people living in the Wild West varied depending on who you were, where you went, and the people you decided to surround yourself with. I'll try to speak about a few different types of people, including store owners, cowboys, and settlers, and I'd love to do a tourist version where someone not familiar with the Wild West went and visited the entire Wild West and learned more about its history. But that wouldn't be fair to the true nature of the Wild West. With that said, let's travel back a couple centuries. And don't worry, I will not be doing a country accent. The Wild West was a time period between the 1860s and the 1890s where an enormous amount of people packed their things and moved out to the western United States. These people came from all walks of life. There were former soldiers who didn't have anywhere to go after the Civil War. There were criminals who were running away from their past, from newly arrived immigrants to wealthy businessmen. People moved out for one reason: opportunity. Some wanted the opportunity to start fresh and others wanted to build on their foundation. But everybody went out west for the sheer potential of the land. Although the Wild West is generally thought to start after the Civil War and go up to the start of the 20th century, there is an argument to be made that the entire Western era started in the 1840s and went all the way up to the 1920s. This would match up pretty nicely with the start of the Western Gold Rush that occurred in the 1840s and the increased prosperity from the end of World War I in the 1920s. The territory that encompassed the West is considered the land west of the Mississippi, although there were very vastly different experiences depending on where specifically you went. If you stayed in the Midwest, you'd probably visit a cattle town. These were towns where the cattle trails went through. Places like Wichita, Kansas, Abilene, Texas, and Cheyenne, Wyoming are examples of this. These places grew rapidly thanks to the access to the railroads and their sparsely populated surroundings. Once the surroundings grew more populated and cattle weren't able to move as freely, more cities would be founded to become cattle towns. Since we're on the topic of cattle towns and cowboys, let's go a little bit more in depth on the cowboy. Cowboys have been a little romanticized throughout history. However, life as a cowboy was dangerous, grueling, and hardly ever worth it. Cowboys went on for months on end with hardly any human interaction. The only interaction they would get would be with their fellow cowboys. Of course, they could talk to the cattle if they were transporting, but I don't think they would get much of a response. The job of a cowboy was extremely dangerous. If you got on another cowboy's nerves, he could kill you right then and there and no one would know what happened to you. The cattle could become rowdy and run you over in a stampede, or you could even fall victim to cattle thieves that were fairly common during the peak of the Wild West. In any case, once the cowboys reached the destination, they would be paid. The wages weren't great. They were paid below average even for that era. But the cowboys used that money to enjoy their time around other people. Gambling, drinking, and prostitution were common expenses for cowboys in cattle towns. Once they were done enjoying the pleasures of life, the cowboys would return to their horses and ride out to wrangle more cattle. A lot of cowboys were long-term cowboys because if you were a cowboy, you didn't really have much to your name. And since you were a cowboy, you weren't going to gain much to put to your name. Actually, that sentence could be said for anyone living in the Wild West. The general aura of distrust and greed grew from the people not having a lot and always wanting more. This couldn't be exemplified even more than the more western states in the gold rush. Starting in the Rocky Mountains and moving out further west to the coast of the Pacific Ocean, gold was almost literally flowing through the mountains. There was seriously a reason as to why so many people moved out west to hopefully strike it rich. The abundance of gold throughout the entire Wild West was on a scale hardly ever seen. With that said, not many people struck it rich. This was because of the bandwagon-esque effect that affected the people. Gold was a limited resource, so it was first come, first served. This is also true for the services that came along with the miners. That's why there are so many ghost towns scattered throughout the Rocky Mountains. People would come, drain the area of gold, and leave to look for more gold. It was honestly a vicious cycle that took a toll on everyone. So the general aura of distrust and greed that perpetuated throughout the entire Wild West was insanely more intense in the mining towns. Since gold was both a precious and limited resource, having some of it stolen could literally mean life or death for your family. And unfortunately, life or death situations tend to bring out the absolute worst in people. With the Wild West being a time of people just doing their best to get by, it seems it would be obvious that there would be people who succeeded and others who failed spectacularly. Some became big businessmen and others became famous outlaws. However, most became unnotable store owners who ran bars, general goods stores, or even blacksmiths. These store owners faced a variety of challenges. I mean, you had a bunch of sketchy people walking around and you had no clue who you could and couldn't trust. Eventually though, a sense of agreement formed between the customers and the store owners. Store owners would use information to their advantage. With the help from people around the town, particularly the ladies of the night, store owners generally knew who they could and couldn't trust and how to handle the people in their shops. That's why you see a common trope in Wild West movies and TV shows where someone walks through the stable doors and everyone looks their way. Newcomers were generally people you couldn't trust because you didn't know about them. Without any information about the newcomer, the store owners and customers didn't know how to react. Granted, movies and TV shows tend to be more on the extreme side. It's not like everyone would stop and stare at someone new walking through the door, but let's roll with it. The store owners used information to their advantage and gained something like the trust of their customers. However, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, outlaws would lie and cheat until they dropped dead. Literally. During the time of the Wild West, the people were the law. Having a sheriff was semi-common, but generally the sheriff was either corrupt and paid off, or they were too scared to get involved with some of the larger criminals that roamed the western United States. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, and, well, a lot of other famous outlaws roamed the Wild West. However, the crimes of outlaws ranged from bank and train robberies to small-time assault. And, of course, murder was a traditional part of being an outlaw. From our point of view in history, outlaws are somewhat admired for their freedom and doing what it took to survive, which is completely fair. However, these outlaws were objectively bad people. I mean, you just can't condone murder, especially when it involves innocent people. But the outlaws that were good at their job were truly the epitome of the Wild West. Just like the Wild West, outlaws spread throughout the entire western United States. The freedom of choice and the hardness of their lives emphasized the spirit of those who moved out west. And finally, the shortness of their lives exemplified how quickly the Wild West came and affected the people of the time. The Wild West was truly a time of freedom and individualism. The temptation for people to move out west was brought forth by opportunity for a new life or the potential to grow an already established foundation. While being one of the harshest times in American history, it also may be the fairest. Death was around the corner for everyone with one wrong step. The outlaws proved it firsthand with their criminal actions. So, for the cowboys, ranchers, store owners, or general people at the time, one wrong move could mean a grave 6 feet under. With that said, the Wild West period came to a close around the 1900s or the 1920s. This was because of the increased involvement of the government improving the lives of its citizens. The cowboys lost their jobs thanks to trains being moved closer to the ranches, and outlaws lost their place thanks to the strictly enforced laws and new people to enforce those laws. As more people moved out west, the territories that encompassed the west were able to form government bodies. This also forced out a lot of the harsher elements of the Wild West. However, the people themselves stayed. I live in Texas, and everywhere you go, you can see a pair of Longhorns. It's also commonplace for people to still wear boots. The history and culture of the West is still entrenched throughout the states it affected, and that's what I believe the legacy of the Wild West should be. A time of unparalleled freedom, marked with death and riches for some, but opportunity for all. I hope y'all enjoyed the dive into the Wild West, and I hope you guys have a fantastic day. Peace.